students, which is great. And 91 attended the kickoff student symposium yesterday. That was wonderful. We're so glad we can gather virtually. And this year, the scientific papers, awards, networking, special interest groups, and even some fun have been planned by your, worked into the next 4 days. Your scientific program committee and the amazing staff from Bostrom have worked really hard to make this the best meeting ever. And my pleasure to now turn it over to Aditya Badawi, who is the chairman of the AAAM 2020 Annual Program Committee Chair. Aditya?
Aditya, I think you might be on mute.
Oh, can you hear me? Okay, thank you, Dr. Bull. Thanks for the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for folks calling from different parts of the world. I'd like to introduce Kerry Danielson, my co-chair, and we are truly excited to welcome you to 2020 AAAM 64th Annual Scientific Conference. Go to the next slide. Thank you. I would like to give a huge shout out to all our conference sponsors, our lead sponsor, especially medical and engineering research consultants, the Transportation Safety Technologies, and Nissan Motor Company for the Student Symposium sponsor as well. Our scientific program subcommittee, over 40 members, have been truly instrumental in going and reviewing close to about 70 papers, full publications, short communications, and poster symposium papers, going through multiple rounds of reviews. And we have truly an esteemed set of technical papers and presentations for you in the next 3.5 days. Huge shout out to all the moderators, students, and mentors. And I wouldn't be doing justice if I don't thank Katie Keel, Colleen, and Randy Flash from Boston staff. You guys are awesome. Thank you. So we are truly a world conference. This is for the first time we've had over 200 registrations from 15 countries. Actually, almost every continent except Antarctica, I guess, similar to last year. We have over 100 unique institutions and more than 50 unique talks, including the keynotes and the 6 speakers. The way the main conference is divided is you will notice we have full presentations, which are about 15 minutes in length, 11 minutes for the speakers, 3 minutes for Q&A, and we have a minute for transition. Similarly, short communications are about 10 minutes each. And different this year is all the poster presentations have been moved to the website. So you can browse your links that Katie and Colleen have sent previously, and you can go online and look at each of those links as well. So under your program, if you look at individual links, the ones that are highlighted have a link to the traffic injury prevention webpage where you can actually review the full paper. So a couple of housekeepings. We are always open to feedback and any participation opportunities. If folks are interested in becoming part of the scientific program committee, we are looking for new members. At the end of each day, you will receive speaker evaluations via email. These are important for us to decide the sort of next year's conference and how to sort of tweak every year, also to award best paper presentations. And for those of you who are on Twitter and LinkedIn, this is a wonderful opportunity. Keep those hashtags going. So Q&A is slightly different this year. So we are all on Zoom. We love Zoom. And under your panels, you can actually see there are multiple tabs. And 2 tabs should stand out. One is the Q&A. The other is the chat feature. Q&A, particularly, you can ask questions to the speakers, and they would be sort of vetted out through the moderators for each of the sessions. And the chat feature, you can engage actively with other attendees. And also, if you have any issues with your Zoom or accessing these events, you can reach out to the AAAM staff as well. So before we get to the serious stuff, thanks to Jessica Jemikian and Katie Keel, we have bingo at AAAM. So Katie's going to be sending out emails for each of you who have registered and signed up. We're going to be playing bingo starting tomorrow and running through Friday, 1:30 Eastern. So there is an exciting gift. It's a $50 gift card at the end of a raffle. And you should be receiving unique bingo cards, which is going to look something very similar to the card up there. It's actually really cool and fun. We're going to be using phrases from injury prevention, automotive safety, and worlds of crash prevention. So keep an eye out for those emails. Also check your spam in case it gets there. I didn't have any issues accessing these pretty cool bingo slides. So good luck to all the players on that note. On that note, let's get to the main theme of this conference. So when we kicked off the 64th planning session late last year, we did have to sort of tweak and change our game of plan. As you know, 2020 has truly been an instrumental sort of start to this decade. What's important and for us as an organization to keep in mind is safety in this next upcoming decade. And we have truly expanded. AAAM has sort of based its premise on the Haddon matrix, looking at the driver, the vehicle, the physical environment. And a recent study by the University of Pennsylvania looked at how do you typically expand on the Haddon matrix, going from your conventional automotive systems to more autonomous and more automated systems, and how do we expand on the Haddon matrix. In conjunction with that, the new decade of action for road safety also has been expanded. It now spans 2020 to 2030. And the theme of this conference has been the premise of how do we move safety beyond our traditional barriers, beyond our traditional automotive systems in the next decade, as we truly go into different automotive configurations, seating configurations, restraint postures, and sort of bringing into effects of automation, disability, teens, children, and beyond. So as you notice, the next couple of days is sort of broadly based on these two premises, and the keynote speakers and our special events are all focusing on automation, road safety, and how do we truly move the needle of safety in reducing injuries in the next decade. So on that, I would like to quickly touch upon our special interest groups, or SIG. So the AAAM board approved and voted on two special interest groups, which is a curated subsegment in the main conference. One is the low and middle income special interest group, and the second is the automated vehicles special interest group, led respectively by Dr. Brian Fildes and Dr. Anuj Pradhan. And we have truly sort of expanded our borders and bringing in global speakers and experts. LMSIG and AVSIG are hosting their sessions on Thursday morning, so stay tuned for 8 fabulous speakers focusing on low and middle income road safety and traffic injuries in the next decade. All right, so with that, we will move on to our keynote speakers. Dr. David Harkey from IHS and Dr. Maria Segue Gomez will be focusing on mobility and automation and how to sort of move the needle in the second decade. We truly are excited and honored and privileged to have both of them speak at AAAM this year. It's been a unique challenge and opportunity for us to have them both and provide their expertise, their experience to this panel and to this group of people to kind of push the needle for safety. And with that, we'll move to our keynote for today. So Dr. David Harkey will be talking on the mobility and automation in the next decade, the role of technology. As we all know, Dr. Harkey is the president of the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety and the Highway Loss Data Institute. He has published in numerous publications focusing on motorists, pedestrians, and bicycles, led projects funded and to the Federal Highway Administration, NHTSA, and public agencies. He requested me to not read through his entire bio, but one fun, interesting tidbit about Dr. Harkey is he's a huge fan of sci-fi and gets all his inspiration from the Yoda. So take it away, Dr. Harkey. Thank you.
Thank you, Aditya. So let me see if I can share my screen with everyone. And change a setting here. Okay. So thank you for the introduction, Aditya, and thank you to AAAM for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. I'm going to focus on the technology aspect of transportation safety, road safety. I know Maria is going to cover tomorrow maybe more of the global aspects of what's happening and a little broader presentation. And I thought what might pair well with what she's going to talk about is to specifically speak to the technology aspects of road safety and where I think we can make some huge strides in the coming decade. This is the technology that we've all heard about, right, for the past decade. And so we've heard these promises dating all the way back to 2010. These are some quotes from the last 3 or 4 years of promises that are being made, hype that is out there with regards to autonomous vehicle technology and self-driving cars. And, you know, a lot of this obviously has not come to fruition as fast as some of the promises that were made. And it's very doubtful that it's going to do so. And one of the things that's real interesting about this is some of you may have seen this kind of technology hype curve that a lot of technologies follow from the time that it begins until it turns into something productive. And you know what we have seen is over the past decade, we have certainly passed what I consider to be this peak of inflated expectations. And I think we've even moved through this trough of disillusionment. And we're coming out on the slope of enlightenment now. And that's reflected in some of the comments that we're now seeing with respect to statements from automakers and some of the tech companies involved about things being a little further away, or that there will always be some constraints on autonomous vehicles as we move forward. So I think this is further out than what was hyped. And I think a lot of us knew that and have known that for some time. And so this has always been my point of view on this is check back with me in 2070. By that point, I will have passed the 100-year-old mark and I'll be ready for my autonomous vehicle. In the meantime, where I think we need to focus and what I've been pushing the Institute to focus on is what we can truly do today to accomplish our mission, which is all about reducing deaths, reducing injuries, preventing damage that are the result of motor vehicle crashes, right? Through our research and evaluation programs, and then by educating consumers, policymakers, and those who are responsible in the field for implementation of interventions. That's what we want to focus on. And what can we get done in the next decade is where I want to spend time today. One of the things that I have encouraged our staff to do, and this is kind of a slight tweak on the Haddon matrix that Aditya showed you earlier, is to apply systems thinking to the problem. If we look around the globe, countries that have adopted a safe systems approach have often driven their fatality numbers down by 50% or more in some cases. And we have not done that here in the US. And so this was something that I was doing when I was at the University of North Carolina's Highway Safety Research Center. It was one of the last things that I was working on there. And when I came to the Institute, it's one of the things that I've tried to bring to our staff is to think more holistically about the challenges that we face in road safety. We still have the components of the Haddon matrix in here. We have the infrastructure piece, we have the vehicle piece, the user, the road user piece of this, and we still think in terms of before, during, and after the crash event. But what's different about this is putting the human being at the center of this and thinking about the frailty of the human being, the fact that human beings will continue to make mistakes, and our need as either owners or users to think about what our individual responsibility is. We all share in the responsibility for creating a safe transportation system and operating a safe transportation system. But thinking about it holistically, what this gives you the opportunity to do is to build in redundancies for any given road safety problem that we have. One of the core components of this particular thinking is speed. And speed's kind of highlighted as its kind of own little specific component here, in part because it's so important to affecting the likelihood of getting in a crash and then the odds of being injured once a crash occurs. And so I think it's really important for us to start thinking about road safety as a systems problem and how we can address it in that way. So let's jump into the technologies. And I want to start with collision avoidance and driver assistance technologies. So we've been evaluating these systems for the better part of a decade now, since they started showing up on some of the vehicles in the US fleet. And as you can see here from our insurance data that we get from our member companies, they are effective. They really are living up to expectations for the most part. The biggest benefits that we are seeing are with front crash prevention systems. So those that have some sort of forward collision warning, those with auto brake technology are the ones that are having the bigger effects. But we're seeing it with other systems too. Lane departure is the one on this particular slide that doesn't show benefit, but we look at other systems, and I've got more detailed slides that look at other things that we've been, like rear view cameras and other things as well. All of them are living up to expectations, and that's a real positive sign as we move forward. When we break it down and start looking at specific collision types, and we look at these technologies with respect to trying to prevent certain types of collisions, the benefits get even larger. And so forward collision warning with auto brake, for example, when you're looking at rear end type collisions, can reduce the total number of crashes by up to 50%. Lane departure warning has an effect when we look at those crashes that involve a vehicle leaving its lane and striking another vehicle or striking an object on the roadside. Blind spot warning, when you look at lane change crashes, it has an effect. So this is a very positive sign. So all of these technologies are having an effect and preventing the kinds of injuries and property damage on our roadways that we would expect. If they're not absolutely preventing the crash, one of the advantages of some of these technologies is they're reducing the speed of the crash. And so this is from a test that we ran a few years ago, showing the difference in a vehicle impacting at 25 miles per hour and 12 miles per hour. And you can see the difference in the damage numbers that you have here. But it's not only a difference in the property damage number. The other thing that is here is that happens as a result of the speed being reduced is less likelihood of being injured. And that's really important when we start, again, thinking about speed as a critical component of the safe systems approach to road safety. Our leverage with the automakers is very much in our top safety pick awards that the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety provides to the automakers. And so one of the things that we've done over the years is while this started out with crash worthiness ratings and occupant protection ratings, we've moved into an era now where we've added criteria for technologies that make a difference. And automatic emergency braking was one of those technologies that we saw early on having a positive safety benefit. And so it's become part of the requirements now that if you're going to get an award from us, you need to have a front crash prevention system that achieves an advanced or superior rating in our tests. And how we determine that is shown in this series of videos. You can see here the difference in two advanced vehicles, two vehicles that get an advanced rating, one that gets a superior rating, in terms of how much speed they scrub off in our test. And so let me run this video for you. And one of the things that you will see here is that if the vehicle goes out of frame, by the way, it's not a good sign. In the slower test, the Subaru, of course, performs best. You can see in the 24-mile-per-hour test, a couple of the vehicles didn't perform extremely well. And again, the Subaru performed best. And it really doesn't matter to us if it's a camera-based system or if it's a radar-based system. We're technology agnostic. We're strictly looking at the performance. And this is how we determine differences in our vehicles. We're proud of our role as what I call pseudo-regulators. You know, we don't do regulation. We rely on NHTSA, US DOT, to do that. But one of the things that we do is fill in the gap sometimes when there's not going to be regulation. And one of the agreements that we worked out a few years ago was with the automakers and with NHTSA to get them to commit to putting AEB on essentially their entire passenger fleet. And so they're working toward that, making AEB a standard feature on all of their vehicles by September of 2022. And they're making good progress toward that. We're proud to say we monitor that every year. And I think this is an example of how we don't necessarily have to have everything in regulation. We can accomplish things in road safety through some voluntary agreements and commitments from some of our partners. So how are the manufacturers doing, and what do things look like from our testing, and how's that evolved over time? If you look in 2013, when we started testing vehicles, 10% of the vehicles had an advanced or superior rating. By the time we got through the 2019 vehicles that we were testing, 75% had achieved one of those two ratings, with most of them being superior. So again, it's a reflection of the automaker's commitment to putting this technology on a lot of vehicles and making sure that the technology works extremely well. And so I think this is a good sign for all of us as we move forward into the next decade. One of the other issues that we're very concerned about, of course, are pedestrian fatalities, and we've all seen the numbers and how they've increased since they hit this low point back in 2009. And so this is a concerning statistic and a real tragedy for all of us. We think vehicle technology and automatic emergency braking can play a role here. Some of this was based on analysis we did within the Highway Loss Data Institute, looking at pedestrian-related claims that were reduced, what we thought were pedestrian-related claims that were reduced by as much as 35%. So on the basis of that, we developed a series of tests to start looking at pedestrian AEB and how well these systems worked at avoiding pedestrians. And so we had adults crossing the road, a child running into the road from behind parked vehicles, and an adult walking along the roadway. So these are the tests that we run. We have released a couple different rounds of results, one for small SUVs, one for mid-sized sedans. And as you can see, again, most of the vehicles perform well, getting a superior or advanced rating, but we still have some of the vehicles that are out there that are getting basic credit or no credit as we define it. And I'll show you a couple examples of what these things are. This is the adult crossing the roadway. No obstruction, tight distance obstruction. You can hear the alarm going off and then the vehicle coming to a stop. This was at 25 miles per hour. This is the hardest test of the three. So this is the child coming out from behind the parked vehicles. And as you can see, this was one that got no credit, obviously, in our test. And so this is an example of how, again, we test these vehicles and we apply the ratings to them. What's next for AEB? Where do we think we're going from here? We've done some research looking at different types of crashes and where AEB performs well and where it does not perform well. It obviously performs very well at what we call the inline crash, right? Two vehicles in a lane, front of a vehicle into the rear of a vehicle in that lane. That's what it was designed to do when you're looking at vehicle-to-vehicle collisions, and it performs very well in those conditions. It doesn't perform as well if one of the two vehicles is turning or changing lanes or merging, if the conditions, road conditions are less than favorable, or if the speeds are really high. And so we've started to look at a series of research tests trying to think about how do we encourage automakers to take the next step? How do we get them and the tier one suppliers to think about how do we improve these systems moving forward to tackle other kinds of collisions that are out there on the road? And so these are a couple tests that we've run. An example of being a turning vehicle, that's what the target is there. You heard the alarm go off and the vehicle stopped. Second vehicle, the alarm went off, but the braking did not occur. And so again, we'll be running more complex tests, looking at these turning scenarios, and I think that's where the next promise is. And for the automakers and those that are developing these systems, we realize this is a challenge, because the thing that you want to do is you want to provide this additional level of safety, but at the same time, you don't want to create a whole lot of false positives. Right, that are going to send warnings off in the vehicle, because that becomes very annoying to the driver and becomes less useful overall. And so that's the challenge that they're going to have. One of the other things we're looking at on the vehicle technology side is really trying to understand, what's referred to in SAE nomenclature as level 2, right? And so these are systems that combine the ability to control the speed and braking and distance from vehicles as it's traveling down the road, the longitudinal control, with the lateral control, the ability to steer. And so you put those two things together and you have level 2 systems now. It's still a driver assistance system. It is not a driver replacement system. It is a driver assistance system. The driver has to be in the loop and paying attention to what's going on. We've done a series of tests. We did this back in 2018, and then we added a few more vehicles this past year, and looking at how these vehicles perform with regards to lane tracking. We've looked at how they go through horizontal curves. That's what this slide shows. And what you see here is that some of the vehicles back in 2018, the Tesla models track through the curves without much of a problem at all. On the other end of the spectrum, you get the BMW 5 Series that disengaged more than half the time. In other words, it's traveling through the lanes and it's saying, I give up. You take over as the driver because I'm not sure what I need to do in terms of tracking through this. One of the things that and if you look at the 2020, you'll see that we had a Tesla and a BMW then that, again, both of them tracked well through the same set of curves. One of the things that's important here is I never talk about this in terms of which one performed best and which one performed worse. There's just a difference in performance, because some of this is based on what the automaker is trying to do in their algorithm that's processing the sensor data. And they have control over how much assistance they want to provide. And I think this is one of the real challenges for the automakers moving forward, is to find that sweet spot between providing a level of driver assistance that the driver is comfortable with and wants, versus providing perhaps too much assistance that the driver becomes complacent of and maybe is a little over-reliant. And I think that's a real challenge for automakers as we move forward, to try and figure out where that sweet spot is. We did the same thing looking at some vertical curves or hills, and same sort of results. You got some differences here in terms of the various vehicles, although, again, looking at the 2020 models, the performance seemed to be better in the context of these two vehicles that we tested of being able to track across these vertical hills. The other thing that we have done over the years is we've had a what we call a user experience program, where we have some of our staff drive these vehicles and fill out surveys. They drive them for a while and they fill out surveys about various aspects of the vehicle. This particular slide, these results reflect their trust in these two systems that we're talking about with level 2 vehicles. How much do they trust the speed and distance capabilities, right? Things like the adaptive cruise control, versus how much do they trust the steering control components, the ability to keep you in the center of the lane. And you can see from this that there's less trust in that latter part, in the lane keeping piece, than there is in the speed and distance component across the board. The other thing to notice in this slide is that the Tesla, which has a really low bar in terms of trust, particularly with the lane keeping system, was one of the vehicles that operationally was able to track through the lanes and the hills that I showed you in the previous slide. So not always a correlation, and some of this is about user feel and comfort. And Tesla's system is maybe a little more aggressive than the others in terms of trying to fight for control between its system when it's turned on and you as the driver. The other thing that's missing with regards to level 2 vehicles is some sort of guidance. There's no regulation currently on how you keep this driver in the loop. Remember, these are driver assistance systems. One of the things that we did earlier this year is we issued what we think is good guidance, good practice in terms of how you monitor and how you then get the attention of drivers who may be out of the loop, how you get them back in the loop. And so what we're recommending is a series of escalating attention reminders that you see here. So starting with a visual reminder that would show up on the dash, and then adding to that, if you didn't respond, an audible or physical alert, and then putting all three of those together, and then even adding brake pulsing beyond that. So it's kind of this escalating warnings that you would get to try and get you back into the loop. I think this is going to be really important because as these systems evolve and as they get better, that's when we run into this issue of perhaps the drivers becoming complacent and becoming distracted at times and getting out of the loop and not paying as much attention to the driving task. And I think this is going to be something that we're going to have to pay attention to moving forward. While there's not regulation currently, we think that the framework that we have set out could serve as the basis for that regulation, should USDOT decide to go in that way. And it is certainly something that we've shared with the automakers and getting them to think about how we think they should approach this particular challenge. All of that's good news in terms of how the technology is working and what we are seeing and how we are seeing things moving. The bad news is this vehicle technology still takes a while. Remember, the average age of a vehicle is approaching 12 years in this country, and it takes a long time for the fleet to turn over. And so what you see here are our projections of when we think various technologies will be available all the way out to 2038. And, you know, essentially it's going to take us till sometime in the 2030s before we get to a point that 80% of the vehicles that are out there on the road have most of these technologies. And so it's going to take a while for this to occur. And that's something we have to keep in mind when we talk about some of the vehicle technology that's out there. I want to flip now to the occupant protection side of things. We have had, or do have currently, about 6 different tests. 3 frontal tests that we run, a rear test, a roof strength test, and a side impact test. And you know, in our top safety pick criteria, you've got to get good ratings in all of those now in order to qualify for one of our awards. These ratings go from good to poor, and they're based on 2 things. One is how the structure of the vehicle performs in the test in terms of intrusion into the occupant compartment, and then what's the risk of injury based on the instrumentation in our dummies. And so we put those 2 things together to come up with our ratings. Over time, just like you saw with the collision systems, the technologies, collision avoidance technologies, automakers have improved from the time we've introduced the test to you know, a lot of vehicles that maybe were performing poorly or marginally at that time. Now we see very few of those. Most of the vehicles we test have good ratings. It just takes longer in some cases for these ratings to improve because you often have to go through an entire design cycle sometimes for a vehicle model to make certain kinds of structural improvements in the vehicle. One of the things that's really important for us in our consumer ratings is making sure that the ratings match what we're seeing in the real world. And so if you look, for example, at the fatality risk of in a head-on crash, it is 46% lower in a good rated vehicle versus a poor rated vehicle. And that's important, because there should be some distinction in the real world that matches what we're seeing in our ratings. Side impact, one of the most successful tests that we have, 70% lower in a good rated, fatality risk is 70% lower in a good rated vehicle versus a poor rated vehicle in our side impact test. And so circling back and looking at this periodically is really important. I mentioned that you have to have good ratings in all 6 of our tests now to receive either of our awards. And this is how the automakers utilize this information. You know, they all strive to make safe vehicles. I have no doubt about that. But they also use our information as in their marketing.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Hyundai's Vice President of National Sales, Randy Parker.
Hyundai's brand positioning is summed up in our slogan, "Better drives us." That statement is much more than a simple tagline to sell cars. It represents who we are and what we do every single day at Hyundai. We are constantly in search of what's better and believe that you can only find it when you put people first, when you improve their lives, protect their loved ones, and build cars with their needs in mind. With the addition of the all-new 2020 Sonata, we now have among the newest product lineups in the industry, and no one, and let me repeat this, no one has more IIHS awards than we do.
So, I think that speaks volumes to, you know, what we are trying to do in terms of influencing automakers. And we have one of our staff who looks at all of these advertisements and awards, by the way, to make sure that there's no false advertising going on. But that does not mean with our Occupant Protection program that we are finished. There's room for improvement, and we are looking at several areas, one of those being the rear seat. Why are we looking at the rear seat? Well, one of the things that we discovered from an evaluation that we did a few years ago, if you look back in early 2000, 2002 and compared fatality risk of the rear seat to the front seat, it looks like the rear seat is safer. As you move through time, then there becomes no difference. And then if you look at the latter years, the front seat looks like it's safer. And it's not that the rear seat has become less safe. It's just that our focus has been on the front seat. Our focus has been on putting technology in the front seat. So whether that's airbags or in the belts, it could be pre-tensioners and load limiters. So we focused on protecting that person in the front seat and haven't paid as much attention to the rear seat. And we think that the time is right to change that for a few reasons. One is the rear seat is where we often have our most vulnerable, right? This is where our children are often riding, or maybe older family members, parents, for example, are riding in the rear seat. And so we think that's an important piece of it. We've also seen a huge increase in ride-hailing services. And we expect that to continue as we move into the future. And so we're going to have more people riding in the rear of vehicles. And so it's important that we get the rear seat up to the same levels that we've gotten the front seat in terms of safety. We did some testing looking at those belt forces in some car-to-car tests and the rear seat occupants. And sure enough, what we found was that the belt loads on the rear seat occupants were 1.5 to 3 times higher for, depending on small car, large car, for those occupants in the rear seat. So we have launched into a series of research tests, and we looked at various dummies, different sizes in the rear seat and different seating positions, trying to figure out if we're going to come up with a test protocol for the rear seat, which dummy should we use to do that and where should we seat them. What we have come up with is a new rear seat occupant test protocol for one of our frontal tests. We're going to use the moderate overlap test, which means that 40% of the front of the vehicle overlaps with the barrier that it is striking. And we're going to use the hybrid 3/5 female seated behind the driver. We think this gives us the best ability to discriminate results between various vehicles. And we're going to roll this out as part of our top safety pick criteria in the 2023 model year. We're also looking at our side impact test. I said that's one of the most successful tests that we've had. Does not mean there is not room for improvement. One of the things that if we look now, you can see on the left-hand side here, almost all of the vehicles that we test are getting good ratings. But if you look on the right-hand side and you look at FARS data and side impact or crashes that are occurring and fatalities that are occurring, 25% of those fatalities are occurring in good rated vehicles. So we know there's room for improvement here. This is the barrier that we created in the early 2000s compared to the NHTSA barrier that was being used. In part, this barrier was created to reflect the increase in SUVs and a higher ride height, a bumper height, hood height of SUVs at that time. And so this program's been very successful. But as we move forward and we realize that we're having these issues with the number of fatalities, there are a couple things that we needed to revise. One is we knew our barrier that we were using was always underweight. It was underweight at the time that we started this test, but as time has moved forward and vehicles have, the mass of vehicles has increased, we need to increase the weight of our barrier. And so we've done that. It's also evident that real-world crashes, speeds are higher. So the amount of energy that's in a real-world crash and a side impact crash is higher than what we were testing. So we've run a series of research tests now with a modified barrier at a higher mass, and then a modern SUV and modern pickup, both at higher masses and at the higher speed. This is what one of those tests looks like. This is an F-150. We're going into a Toyota Camry. And at the higher speed, Toyota Camry is one of the vehicles that performs best in our current side impact test protocol. And it actually performed pretty well in this test too. And so we know that the structures of some of the best vehicles now can handle some of this increased energy that is going to occur in our new tests. We started to see some results from our test looking at how our barrier performs versus how these new SUVs and pickups perform. There are differences in the vehicle kinematics in terms of which direction the vehicle rolls. There's also differences in terms of the impact patterns. Our barrier is a more flat profile in terms of deformation in the vehicle that you can see here, whereas the actual vehicles that we were running, more of an M shape, kind of wrapping around the B pillar that you can see. So a lot of work has gone into coming up with a new barrier in which we've modified the shape and the stiffness to match what we're seeing in these actual vehicle-to-vehicle tests. We're also going to increase the speed and we're going to increase the mass, as you can see here. And again, we're going to roll this out as a new protocol for our top safety pick criteria in 2023. The other area on occupant protection that we know we can save lives has to do with belt use. We all know the statistic of half of the fatalities in passenger vehicles are unbelted occupants. And we know there are lives that can be saved here. We also know that we can be more aggressive with regards to how we get people to buckle up. We've done some research looking at different metrics for this, different interventions. And so some of that is if you have to buckle up to shift, or if the speed limited devices that are out there, you can't go faster than 15 miles per hour unless you have your seatbelt buckled up. But one of the things we discovered in this research was that an extended chime has just as much of an effect. And so again, as part of our top safety pick criteria in the near future, we'll be rolling out guidance for automakers that in order to qualify for an award, you're going to need to at least have what's shown here. So if you want to get an acceptable rating, you're going to have a front reminder that lasts at least 90 seconds. And if you want to get that good rating, you also need to include a rear seat status indicator or change in status indicator. So if somebody unbuckles their seatbelt while you're driving down the road, that you get notification of that. So these are the kinds of things we're looking at. And finally, I'd be remiss at talking about technology if I didn't speak to changing behavior and technologies that are out there that can help us change behaviors that are outside of the vehicle in some cases. The two big problems that we have with behavior continue to be impairment and speeding. And on the impairment side, we know that ignition interlocks can go a long ways to reducing the number of fatal crashes we have. And so instead of just using ignition interlocks for repeat offenders, where you can drive down the number of fatal crashes by 3%, why not put it on all vehicles that have all DUI offenders, including first offenders, and regardless of BAC levels, where you can drive those numbers down 16%. I know this takes willpower and it takes policy changes to do this sort of thing, but I think the technology is there, and that's what's important, that we can make these kinds of changes. Longer term, but I think still in the coming decade, is passive alcohol detection. And so lots of effort has been put into the DAD system, and it's out there being tested now in the real world with the breath-based alcohol sensor. We think, and we've done a recent analysis of this, one of our researchers has, we think that if there is a mandate, and I do think there will have to be a NHTSA mandate, this will have to be regulated to get automakers to do this. But if they do this, we think that more than 1,000 lives could be saved each year in the first 3 years. Over a 12-year period, we think we could save 4,600 lives per year. Long term, more than 9,000 lives annually. I think this is a really promising technology, but again, it's a vehicle technology, and so it's going to take time to get implemented, and it's going to take time for the fleet to turn over, but I do think we can get started on this in the next decade. Speeding, we all know the picture here of how speed limits have gone up across the board since we've lost the national maximum speed limit back in the early 90s, and they continue to rise. One of the things on the vehicle side we're facing here that's really important to know is that horsepower in vehicles has continued to rise. You know, you can look back just 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, you can pick your time frame for different vehicles, and you can see how much more powerful vehicles are today than they were just a few years ago. This is obviously playing into the speed portion, and we've done analysis to show that very thing, that yes, higher horsepower vehicles do result in higher speeds out there on the roadway. We know that from some of the research that we've done. And so this is a really important piece when you start talking about automakers and what they can do to help, that we need to figure out how to address. And it's also continuing to be utilized in the commercials that automakers are using to sell vehicles.
You don't want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
So Dodge last year, this was over Labor Day last year, had a rebate program where you got $10 back for every horsepower you purchase. So you could take that vehicle that we were just showing, and if you want to buy the 300 horsepower variant of that, you could get $3,000 back. Or you could really go in. You want to buy the almost 800 horsepower version of this vehicle, you could get $8,000 back. So this is one side of the coin that we're fighting when it comes to automakers and selling vehicles. This is the other side of the coin. This is Volvo's Vision 2020, where they've limited the top speed of their vehicles to 112 miles per hour. And as the CEO says, that, you know, in a quote in March of last year, you know, it's not a cure-all, but if it saves one life, it's worth doing. And so I do think that there are automakers out there that are willing to address this problem, and we need to figure out how to work with them. The other piece of technology, roadway technology, operations technology that is out there is available. We know works in other countries. We know it works in this country in places where it's installed, is automated enforcement. And we need to do more of this. You just have to be smart about how you do it, where you implement it. It often requires changes in legislation. We know that. And so that's sometimes a challenge. And it really does require community support. You have to build that support from the ground up. And you've got to make sure that you're messaging it correctly, that it's about saving lives. It's not about generating revenue. All of that's really important. We have put out with some of our partners a checklist for automated enforcement as it relates to red light camera programs. The same principles apply when it comes to building support and getting these systems implemented for automated speed enforcement. And so that's really, really important. And finally, I will leave you with this, which is, you know, each of our organizations, each of us individually, we all have a vested interest in doing what we can to improve safety, but we are stronger together. And we need to figure out how to leverage partnerships. And I've said in a couple recent presentations and panels I've been a part of, we need to figure out how to speak with one voice more often. I don't think we do that enough. And I think we have to figure out a way to do that. And this is another quote from, when you think about partners, the auto industry can be a big partner in this. And this is from the Volvo CEO again, thinking about, do automakers have an obligation to put technology in cars that change a driver's behavior and to tackle those things of speeding, impairment, distraction? And I think that's a real good sign if you have an automaker thinking that way. And finally, the image at the bottom here, I used to have to go testify to the North Carolina legislature about not repealing North Carolina's motorcycle helmet law. And I could give them all the statistics in the world. I could show them the tragedies that result immediate consequences in states that had repealed their laws and the impacts of that. I could give them all those numbers in the world. It was never as powerful a message, and it was never going to be as powerful a message as what's shown in this image, when a group of trauma surgeons showed up and talked about the kinds of injuries they were treating from motorcycle riders who were involved in crashes and not wearing a helmet. And the conversations that they had to have with immediate family members about the long-term consequences that were going to result and how it was going to change their lives forever because of decision made not to wear helmets. And that was a powerful enough message. And it's one that has I've seen resonate over and over with this group, and it really makes a difference. And so sometimes you have to think outside the box and figure out how to leverage partnerships that you may not have considered beforehand. Bottom line is technology can make a difference in the next decade, but it has to be a comprehensive approach. It can't just be vehicle technology. It has to include technologies that change the way we operate our roadways. It has to be technologies that tackle some of the behavior issues and problems that we know exist today. All of this has to be looked at together. And then finally, we all need to figure out how to work together more effectively to save lives today. And so with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you today, and I'll turn it back over to Aditya.
Thank you, Dr.
Harkey.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Carrie Danielson will help coordinate the questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harkey, for starting the conference with such an enjoyable and informative presentation. We have a few questions in our question and answer box that I'll relay to you. The first is that I believe your testing implies that the front seat may be safer than the rear seat in the latest vehicle years. We currently recommend children younger than 13 that are able to be transported in an adult belt to be seated in the rear seat. Does your data imply we should change pediatric recommendations?
Yeah, and I think it's a real intriguing question to answer. And it's one of those questions that we internally, even we've had this discussion among our staff as to, are we changing that recommendation? I don't think we're changing that recommendation just yet. But I certainly think the data is there that puts us on the fence about whether it is good to have that 13-year-old still sitting in the rear seat, which right now, personally, I would still put them in the rear seat, or whether it's safer to have them in the front seat. And so I think it's an example of why I think it's so important that we improve the technology in the rear seat as quickly as we can in order to be able to continue to have confidence that rear seat is the safest place for that 13-year-old.
Our next one is, you mentioned that in some situations, vehicles with automated braking systems have higher crash ratings than the same vehicles without the AEB. Do you think this could be because different kinds of drivers are choosing to get automated braking?
Yeah, I don't think we have any evidence of that. I don't think we know enough to know the driving characteristics or the demographics or some of those other driver characteristics about who's buying what vehicles. But I do think that it's something that could be looked at over time to see if we think there are differences in demographics and the kinds of safety features that they are buying. One of the things that I will say on that front that's really, really important, and one of the things that we're starting to push for more now is to make sure that all of these technologies become standard equipment. They're not optional equipment on a vehicle. That is really, really important, because what happens is you start to create this divide in the price of the vehicle, right? We've always had this issue in vehicles, that the best safety technologies are often available on luxury line vehicles or on the luxury trim levels. And so those that have the most money can afford the most safety. We need to correct that. Safety should be affordable to everybody. And so we are pushing the automakers to make a lot of this equipment standard rather than optional.
Okay. Another one we have here is that you mentioned that IIHS is moving towards a safe systems approach to transportation. Does IIHS have any efforts to influence municipal adaptation of infrastructure changes? And if so, what type of infrastructure designs?
So I think this is an area where we need to work. I was talking about partnerships. And so one of the things that, we are definitely involved with the Road to Zero Coalition and are helping with that effort. And we have other partnership efforts outside of that, working with groups like the Institute for Transportation Engineers that involves a lot of local municipal designers and planners and those that build the local systems. And so we are trying to work with those groups to have more influence about how roadways are designed. And they've also adopted, ITE has also adopted the safe systems approach. And so there's more momentum in this country now with regards to trying to take that approach, that holistic approach to road safety than there's ever been.
Okay, I think we have time for one more and then we'll wrap it up. How do we encourage parents to provide vehicles with the best safety systems for their teen drivers rather than the fallback of buying an older car?
Yeah, great question. And we just did 2 releases, one in July and one just a couple weeks ago. So the one in July was the list of best used vehicles for your teen. And the one we just released a couple weeks ago was best new vehicles to consider for your teen. Now, obviously, the latter one is a little more expensive. I think the price range was like $22,000 to $37,000, whereas the used vehicle list, I think the range was maybe $6,000 to $20,000, something like that. But the key is to buy as much safety as you can afford for your teen. And so if you want to think about a new vehicle and you can do that, great, because that's going to include more of the collision avoidance technologies than the used vehicle list. And even if you're thinking about buying a new vehicle for your family, for you, that you're going to hand down in a couple of years, it's a good list to start from and to think about. And one of the things that changed on this year's list from when we first started doing this back in 2014 is this list now includes not only our safety criteria, but it includes consumer reports, reliability ratings, and performance ratings. And so it takes the best testing from both organizations and combines them to create this list. And so it's available, both these lists are available on our website at iahs.org.
All right, thank you very much. I'll turn it back over to Aditya to close out our session.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Harkey. Your insights on system safety and the holistic approach to safety is truly appropriate as we kind of jump into the next decade for injury prevention and bringing in automotive medicine into this. So thank you again for your time, your schedule. I know your schedule is extremely jam-packed. So we truly appreciate your participation and also encourage you to stay on through the rest of the conference and participate as per your availability. With that, I will turn this over to Katie. We will be joining our board member, Dr. Matt Maltese, for a virtual networking session. Thank you.